There are places on Earth where sound itself seems to forget its own existence, where the normal hum and buzz of the world drops away so completely that what remains isn't quite silence in the way we usually understand it. It becomes something denser, something that presses in from all sides, a presence rather than an absence. And if you've ever wondered what it might feel like to exist in a space where nothing moves and nothing echoes, and the very idea of noise feels like a distant memory from some other version of reality, then perhaps you've already imagined what rests at the very bottom of the ocean, miles below the surface, far past where light can reach, in a darkness so total and a stillness so profound that even calling it quiet seems insufficient. You're in the right place if that thought pulls at something inside you, if the notion of absolute silence feels less like emptiness and more like a kind of weight you could lean into, something vast and patient and undisturbed. If this kind of reflection brings you a measure of calm, if these slow journeys into the hidden corners of the planet help you step away from the noise of the day, you can subscribe to Quiet Science and continue exploring these quiet depths with us. Though there's no urgency in that, only an invitation to return whenever you need a place like this. The ocean, after all, is not one thing but many things stacked on top of each other, layer upon layer of water growing colder and darker and heavier the farther down you go. And somewhere in that descent, somewhere past the point where most life has thinned out and the pressure becomes almost unimaginable, there exists a kind of stillness that doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. A quietness so complete that it challenges the very notion of what we mean when we say we need peace. What does it mean for a place to be silent, not because sound has been removed, but because sound was never invited in the first place? What happens in the spaces where the earth has created something closer to a vacuum of noise, not in the absence of air, but in the presence of so much water, so much distance, so much sheer separateness from everything we know about how the world sounds? And maybe, before we can understand what exists there, we have to first understand what it means to be far, enough away from the surface that even the memory of waves feels impossibly distant. We tend to think of silence as the absence of something, as what's left over when sound has been taken away. But that understanding only works in places where sound was possible to begin with, where the conditions exist for vibrations to travel and reach our ears and register as noise or music or the simple background hum of existence. The deep ocean doesn't work that way. The silence there isn't what remains after something louder has stopped. It's the default state, the foundation, the thing that was there first and will be there after everything else has passed through. It has a quality to it, a texture, almost a flavor if such a thing were possible to taste. And maybe the closest we can come to understanding it is to recognize that in the deepest parts of the ocean, silence isn't empty space, but rather a kind of fullness, a saturation of quiet so complete that it becomes the dominant characteristic of the environment itself, more present than the water, more defining than the darkness, more inescapable than the pressure that pushes in from every direction at once. Sound, when you really think about it, is just movement translated into something our brains can interpret. Molecules bumping into other molecules, energy passing through a medium, creating waves that ripple outward until they either fade or encounter something that absorbs them or reflects them back. In air, sound moves quickly, roughly 767 miles per hour at sea level, fast enough that we experience most sounds as nearly instantaneous, the gap between cause and effect so small that it barely registers. In water, sound actually moves faster, nearly 4 times as fast, because water molecules are packed more tightly together, allowing vibrations to pass from one to the next with greater efficiency. You'd think this would make the ocean a noisy place, and near the surface, in certain ways, it is. Waves crash, ships pass, whales call to each other across vast distances, their songs traveling hundreds of miles through the medium that carries sound so well. But that efficiency, that speed, only matters if there's something making sound in the first place, something moving or breaking or colliding with enough force to create those initial vibrations. And in the deepest trenches, In the hadal zone, where the ocean floor drops away into chasms that make the Grand Canyon look shallow, there is almost nothing moving at all. The water there is cold, colder than most refrigerators, hovering just a few degrees above freezing, and cold water is denser than warm water, heavier, more resistant to motion. Currents that churn and swirl near the surface barely reach these depths, and when they do, they move so slowly that calling them currents feels like an exaggeration. They're more like the gradual drift of something settling, the way dust might move through still air if you waited long enough to notice. And without movement, without the friction and turbulence that come from water flowing over rocks, or through narrow channels, or being pushed by wind or tides, there's nothing to generate sound. The water simply sits there, layer upon layer of it pressing down, each layer adding its weight to the one below, until at the very bottom, the pressure is so immense that it would crush almost anything from the surface world in an instant, compressing it into something unrecognizable, something flattened and dense and broken. But pressure doesn't make noise. It's a force, yes, a constant and unrelenting force, but it acts equally in all directions, pushing inward on every surface with the same intensity. And that uniformity means there's no differential, no place where pressure is greater or lesser, no gradient that might cause something to shift or crack or release energy in a way that would create sound. The silence at the bottom of the ocean isn't the silence of a quiet room where you can still hear your own breathing, or the faint hum of electronics, or the distant rumble of traffic. It's the silence of a place where the very mechanisms that produce sound have been removed from the equation, where the environment itself has become so still, so stable, so perfectly balanced that nothing disturbs it, nothing breaks the equilibrium, nothing vibrates. And maybe that's what makes it so difficult to imagine, this kind of silence, because we've never experienced anything quite like it. Even in the quietest places we can visit on land, deep caves, remote deserts, soundproofed rooms designed to eliminate all external noise, there's still the sound of our own bodies, our heartbeat, our breath, the small movements we make without thinking. But the ocean floor exists independent of us, indifferent to us, maintaining its silence whether we're there to witness it or not. And that silence extends in all directions, not just horizontally across the vast flatness of the abyssal plains, but vertically as well. Thousands of feet of water between the bottom and the surface, each foot adding to the insulation, creating a buffer so thick and so unmoving that the sounds of the surface world, the storms, the breaking waves, the engines of ships, passing overhead, never make it down, never penetrate that deep, dissipating long before they reach the place where the ocean becomes something else entirely, something more like stone than liquid, something that holds its stillness the way a mountain holds its shape, unchanging and patient, and utterly unconcerned with anything happening anywhere else. Perhaps the silence isn't there because sound can't exist, but because nothing has disturbed it enough to break it. And in that undisturbed space, in that perfect absence of vibration, the ocean has created something rare enough that most of the planet will never know it. Water, at the surface, feels like something we understand. It flows, it splashes, it responds to touch with a familiar yielding quality, moving around our hands or our bodies with an ease that makes it seem almost weightless, almost cooperative in the way it parts and rejoins and finds its level. But water is not a single thing with a single set of properties. It changes depending on where it is, how deep it goes, how much of itself is piled on top of itself, and somewhere in that accumulation, somewhere in the descent from surface to floor, it crosses a threshold where it stops behaving like the water we know and becomes something stranger, something that resists and compresses and holds its form in ways that seem impossible for a liquid. At the bottom of the ocean, water is still water in the chemical sense, still H2O molecules bound together in their familiar arrangement, but the experience of it, the physical reality of it, has shifted into something dense enough, heavy enough, that it starts to take on qualities we usually associate with solids, with things that don't move easily, that push back when pushed, that carry weight in a way we can almost feel, even from thousands of miles away. Every 10 meters you descend into the ocean, the pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere, which is the amount of pressure we experience at sea level from all the air stacked above us, pressing down on every surface with a force we've adapted to so completely that we don't notice it anymore. 10 meters down, the pressure doubles. You're carrying the weight of the air and the weight of 10 meters of water. 20 meters down, it triples. 30 meters, quadruples. The progression is linear, predictable, relentless, and by the time you reach the hadal zone, the deepest trenches where the ocean floor drops to depths of 6 or 7 or even 11,000 meters, the pressure has become so immense that it defies easy comprehension. 600, 800, over 1,000 times the pressure we experience on land, a force so great that it would collapse a human body instantly, compressing lungs and cavities and any pocket of air into something unrecognizable, forcing everything inward with a strength that makes steel bend and submarines groan and even the water itself change in subtle but meaningful ways. Under that kind of pressure, water molecules pack closer together, not by much, but enough that the density increases measurably. Enough that a cubic meter of water at the bottom of the Mariana Trench weighs noticeably more than a cubic meter of water at the surface, maybe 5% more, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that we're talking about thousands upon thousands of cubic meters. An entire ocean's worth of volume, all of it pressing down, all of it adding to the weight, all of it contributing to an environment where movement becomes costly, where even the act of displacing water requires more energy than it would anywhere else. And in a place where movement is costly, movement becomes rare. And in a place where movement is rare, the conditions for sound, the vibrations, the collisions, the transfer of energy from one molecule to the next, simply don't arise very often. And when they do, they dissipate quickly, absorbed by the density of the medium itself, swallowed by water that's so compressed it acts almost like a cushion, dampening disturbances before they can travel very far. It's strange to think of water as thick, as something that resists flow, because our entire experience of it suggests the opposite. Water is what we use to describe things that move easily, that adapt, that find their way through and around obstacles with minimal effort. But thickness is relative, and at depths where the pressure is measured in tons per square inch, where every molecule is squeezed against its neighbors with a force that never lets up, water begins to behave less like a fluid and more like something caught between states, not quite solid but no longer fully liquid in the way we understand liquidity. Submarines that descend to even moderate depths report a sensation of moving through something heavier than expected, a resistance that's subtle but real. And while most of those vehicles never approach the true depths where this effect becomes pronounced, the few unmanned probes that have reached the hadal zone and returned with data suggest that the water there has a viscosity, a reluctance to flow, that's measurably different from surface water, enough that anything trying to move through it would have to work harder, expend more energy, overcome more inertia just to change position. And if water resists movement, if the density and pressure create an environment where flow is difficult and disturbance is dampened, and the natural tendency is towards stillness, then the silence that exists there isn't just the absence of sound-making events. It's the active suppression of them, the water itself serving as insulation, as a barrier, as a medium so heavy and so unresponsive that even if something did try to make noise, the noise wouldn't propagate the way it would elsewhere, wouldn't carry, wouldn't reach very far before being absorbed back into the dense matrix of molecules that surround it on all sides. The deep ocean is silent, not only because nothing is making sound, but because the environment has become fundamentally inhospitable to sound, a place where the physics of vibration and transmission run up against conditions so extreme that the normal rules stop applying, where silence becomes the path of least resistance, the natural state, the thing that requires no energy to maintain because everything about the place, its depth, its pressure, its cold, its density, conspires to preserve it. Maybe that's what silence really is at that scale. Not the removal of noise, but the creation of conditions where noise becomes impossible, where the world has arranged itself in such a way that quiet is the only option. and everything else is simply too difficult, too costly, too unlikely to ever arise. Light doesn't disappear all at once when you descend into the ocean. It fades gradually, reluctantly, giving up its presence one color at a time, starting with the warm end of the spectrum and working its way through until nothing remains but a memory of what brightness used to mean. Red goes first, absorbed by the water within just a few meters of the surface, so that blood looks green down there, and anything red in the world above becomes grey or black almost immediately upon submersion. Orange follows, then yellow, each wavelength surrendering to the water's capacity to absorb light, to pull energy out of photons and convert it into heat so minimal you'd never feel it, but enough that the light itself ceases to exist as light, becomes something else, becomes motion at the molecular level, becomes a tiny increment of warmth distributed across so much cold water that it might as well be nothing. Green light persists a bit longer, and blue longer still, which is why the ocean looks blue when you're near the surface, why photographs taken in shallow water have that azure quality we associate with tropical seas and coral reefs. But even blue light, even the most penetrating wavelength in the visible spectrum, can only go so far before it too gives up, before it too gets absorbed or scattered or reflected back upward, leaving behind a darkness that isn't like nighttime on land, isn't like closing your eyes in a dark room, but rather something more complete, more total, more absolute in its refusal to allow any form of visual information to exist. By 200 meters down, you've entered what oceanographers call the twilight zone, though calling it twilight suggests there's still some relationship to day and night, some cycle of light and dark that mirrors what happens at the surface, and that's not quite accurate. The light that reaches this depth is so faint, so diffuse, that it barely registers as illumination, more like a dim glow that tells you there's a surface somewhere above, but offers almost nothing in terms of visibility. Nothing you could use to see shapes or colors or distances. Creatures that live at this depth have adapted to near total darkness, developing eyes that are either enormously large to capture every stray photon, or no eyes at all because sight has become irrelevant, a sense that requires too much energy to maintain for too little benefit. And this is still only the upper edge of the deep ocean, still a place where some light exists, however faint, however useless it might seem to us. The real darkness, the kind that defines the hadal zone, doesn't even begin until you pass 1,000 meters, until you cross the threshold into what's called the midnight zone, where the absence of light isn't a matter of degree but of kind, where photosynthesis becomes physically impossible because there simply aren't enough photons reaching that depth to power the chemical reactions that plants and algae depend on, where the entire ecosystem has to function without any energy input from the sun, relying instead on whatever organic matter drifts down from above or whatever chemical energy can be extracted from the earth itself through deep-sea vents and seeps. Darkness and silence aren't separate phenomena down there. They're different aspects of the same isolation, the same removal from the world of surfaces and storms and seasons. When light can't reach a place, when photons can't penetrate the layers of water between the sun and the seafloor, you're already in a realm that exists outside the normal cycles of day and night, outside the rhythms that govern most of life on Earth, and that removal from the solar cycle, that independence from the sun's influence, creates a kind of timelessness, a sense that nothing changes here because there's nothing to mark the passage of time. No sunrise, no sunset, no shifting shadows or changing colors, just an unchanging blackness that was there yesterday and will be there tomorrow and has been there for millions of years without variation. And in that darkness, in that complete absence of visual stimuli, the silence becomes more noticeable, more pronounced, because we tend to rely on multiple senses to understand our environment, to triangulate our position in space. And when one sense is entirely removed, when sight becomes impossible, we become more aware of what we can and cannot hear, more attuned to the presence or absence of sound. But there's nothing to hear. The darkness isn't hiding anything, isn't concealing sounds that exist but can't be seen. It's accompanying the silence, reinforcing it, creating an environment where sensory deprivation isn't a technique or an experiment, but simply the default condition of existence. No light means no visual predators hunting by sight, which means no need for sudden movements, no chases, no disturbances that might create sound. No photosynthesis means no plants swaying in currents, no oxygen production through biological processes, no bubbles rising or leaves rustling, or any of the small background noises that even quiet places on land never quite eliminate. The deep ocean isn't just dark and quiet, it's dark and quiet in a way that's mutually reinforcing, where each absence strengthens the other, where the removal of light makes the silence more complete, and the silence makes the darkness more absolute, until you're left with an environment that's been stripped down to almost nothing, reduced to its most basic elements, water and pressure and cold, and an emptiness that extends in all directions without relief. Perhaps that's what makes it so difficult to truly grasp, this combination of sensory voids, because we're built to perceive, to gather information, to constantly update our understanding of where we are and what's around us, and a place that offers no information, that presents nothing to see and nothing to hear, and no way to orient yourself except through instruments that translate invisible forces into numbers and graphs, feels less like a physical location and more like an abstraction, a theoretical space that shouldn't exist, but does, somewhere far below the reach of almost everything we consider normal or necessary or alive. Distance, when measured vertically, feels different than distance measured across a landscape. Crossing 5 miles of open ground gives you time to see what's ahead, to adjust your path, to recognize landmarks and gauge your progress. But falling or descending 5 miles straight down offers no such reference points, no way to know how far you've come, except by instruments that translate depth into numbers, and numbers don't capture the experiential reality of having that much space between you and the place you started. The deepest parts of the ocean lie roughly 7 miles below the surface, 7 miles straight down through water that gets colder and darker and heavier with every foot of descent. And while 7 miles might not sound overwhelming when you think about driving that distance or walking it over the course of an afternoon, the vertical dimension changes everything, transforms that measurement into something that feels almost geological, almost planetary in scale, as if you're not just going deeper into the ocean but traveling toward a different version of Earth entirely, one that exists in parallel to the surface world but operates by different rules, under different conditions, with a separateness so complete that the two realms barely interact at all. Sound, in theory, can travel through water across vast distances. Whale songs cover hundreds of miles, submarine sonar bounces off objects dozens of miles away, and during the Cold War, the US military deployed listening stations that could detect underwater sounds from across entire ocean basins, picking up the low-frequency rumble of submarines or the seismic activity of underwater earthquakes from thousands of miles away. But those sounds travel horizontally, moving through water at roughly the same depth, staying within layers where temperature and salinity and pressure remain relatively constant, creating what's called a sound channel, a natural waveguide that keeps acoustic energy from dissipating too quickly, allowing it to propagate much farther than it would if it had to pass through the full range of ocean conditions. Vertical transmission is different. Sound moving up or down through the water column has to cross boundaries between layers, has to pass through zones where temperature drops sharply or pressure increases dramatically, and each of those transitions acts as a kind of barrier, reflecting some of the sound back, refracting some of it at angles that carry it away from its original path, absorbing some of it into the water itself, until what started as a clear signal becomes fragmented and weakened, and eventually lost altogether, dissipated into the enormity of the vertical distance it tried to cross. The ocean isn't a uniform volume, it's stratified, layered like a cake where each layer has different properties, different densities, different temperatures, and those differences matter enormously for how things move through it, including sound. Near the surface, where sunlight warms the water and waves mix it constantly, you have what's called the mixed layer, a zone maybe 50 or 100 meters deep where conditions are relatively uniform, where temperature and salinity don't vary much from top to bottom because the energy of wind and waves keeps everything churned up and homogeneous. Below that, you enter the thermocline, a region where temperature drops rapidly with depth, falling from the relative warmth of surface water toward the near-freezing temperatures of the deep. And that gradient, that steep change in temperature over a relatively short vertical distance, creates a boundary that sound doesn't cross easily, a transition zone where acoustic energy tends to bend and reflect rather than continue downward in a straight line. And below the thermocline, in the deep layer that extends from roughly 1,000 meters down to the seafloor, temperatures stabilize at just a few degrees above freezing, and pressure becomes the dominant factor, increasing steadily and predictably, adding weight and density and resistance with every meter of additional depth. These layers don't just affect how sound travels, they also determine whether sound from the surface can reach the bottom at all, and in most cases, it can't, not in any meaningful way. A ship passing overhead generates noise, certainly. Propellers churning, engines running, hull vibrations resonating through the water. But that noise is concentrated near the surface, trapped within the mixed layer and the upper reaches of the thermocline, bouncing around in the warmer, less dense water where it was created. Some of it might penetrate deeper, might make it through the thermocline and into the colder water below, but by that point it's been scattered and weakened so much that it barely qualifies as sound anymore, more like a faint pressure variation, a subtle disturbance that dissipates quickly and leaves no trace. And even if some fraction of that surface noise did somehow make it all the way down to the hadal zone, traveling through 7 miles of stratified water, crossing multiple thermoclines and density boundaries and pressure gradients, it would arrive as something unrecognizable, so attenuated and distorted that it would be indistinguishable from the ambient background, from the faint seismic creaks of the Earth's crust, or the distant settling of sediment, or the occasional movement of deep currents that are themselves so slow they barely constitute movement at all. The ocean, in this sense, functions as a kind of insulation, not in the thermal sense, though it does that too, but acoustically, creating a barrier between the noisy surface world and the silent depths below. And that barrier isn't a single wall or membrane, but rather a volume, a three-dimensional space filled with water that absorbs and deflects and scatters sound until nothing from above can penetrate it, until the separation becomes so complete that the deep ocean might as well be on another planet, might as well be sealed off entirely from the storms and waves and human activity that define the surface. 7 miles of water is 7 miles of insulation, 7 miles of cushioning, 7 miles of distance that acts as a filter, removing everything we associate with the world we know. The noise of wind, the crash of breaking waves, the hum of civilization, the biological chatter of surface life, leaving only what belongs to the deep itself, which is almost nothing, which is silence preserved not by effort, but by sheer remoteness, by the simple fact that the surface is too far away to matter, too distant to influence, too separated by layers of cold, heavy water to ever intrude on the stillness that exists at the bottom. And perhaps that distance, that vertical separation, is what makes the silence so pure, so undisturbed. Because it's not just that nothing is making noise down there, it's that nothing from anywhere else can bring noise with it, cannot carry sound across that much depth, cannot bridge the gap between the surface world and the hadal world, and so the quiet persists, unbroken, as if the ocean had decided that some places should remain untouched by everything happening above. Cold has a way of slowing everything down, not just in the obvious sense of making things move more sluggishly or respond more slowly, but at the fundamental level of molecular activity, the microscopic dance of particles that underlies all motion and all heat and all the processes we think of as life or chemistry or change. Temperature, after all, is just a measurement of how fast molecules are moving, how much kinetic energy they have, how vigorously they're vibrating and colliding with their neighbors. And when you cool something down, when you remove heat energy from it, you're not adding cold as if cold were a substance. You're subtracting motion, reducing the average speed of molecules until they settle into a slower, calmer, more constrained version of themselves. At the bottom of the ocean, where temperatures hover just a few degrees above the freezing point of seawater, somewhere around 2 degrees Celsius, or maybe slightly less in the deepest trenches, the water molecules are moving as slowly as they can, while still remaining liquid, still maintaining that fluid quality that allows them to flow and surround and fill space, but barely, just barely, teetering on the edge of a phase transition that would lock them into ice if the temperature dropped even a fraction of a degree further, or if the salinity were just slightly different. But it doesn't freeze, not quite, and the water remains liquid, but takes on a different character at that temperature, a heaviness and reluctance that's distinct from the density caused by pressure. This is the coldness itself, the reduction in molecular motion, the way everything at that temperature becomes lethargic in a way that's difficult to perceive from the surface world, where we're used to warmer water, water that moves more freely, that carries heat and distributes it and responds to changes with what feels like immediacy. Cold water doesn't respond quickly to anything. It resists mixing, resists flowing, resists the kind of turbulent churning that happens in warmer layers where temperature differences create convection currents and drive circulation. At near freezing temperatures, those dynamics shut down almost entirely. The water becomes stratified not just by depth, but by its own unwillingness to move, each layer sitting heavily on the one below it, maintaining separation not because there's a physical barrier, but because the energy required to overcome the cold and the density and the pressure is simply more than most natural processes can provide. And so the water stays where it is, unchanged, unmoving, stable in a way that makes time feel different, slower, as if clocks run at a different rate down there, where nothing hurries and nothing needs to hurry, because there's no daylight marking hours and no seasons marking months and no temperature variation marking the passage of years. Time, in a sense, becomes geological at those temperatures, measured not in seconds or minutes, but in the gradual accumulation of sediment, the slow drift of tectonic plates, the deep cycles of ocean circulation that take 1,000 years to complete a single loop, moving water from the poles where it cools and sinks, down into the deep ocean basins where it spreads out and flows along the bottom, eventually rising again in some distant part of the world, centuries or millennia later. The water at the bottom of the Mariana Trench might have last seen the surface during the Middle Ages, might have been in contact with air and light when ships were still made of wood and navigation was done by stars. And since then, it's been traveling, imperceptibly slowly, through the deep ocean's circulation system, never warming up, never speeding up, just moving at the pace that cold, dense water moves, which is to say, barely at all from any human perspective, barely detectably even with sophisticated instruments designed to measure currents and flows too subtle for our senses to register. And in that cold, in that near stasis, chemical reactions slow down, biological processes reduce to a minimum. Everything that depends on molecular collisions and energy transfers operates at a fraction of the rate it would in warmer water. Metabolism drops, growth slows. Decay becomes so gradual that organic matter can persist for extraordinary lengths of time before breaking down completely, preserved not by freezing, but by the simple fact that the cold reduces activity to such a low level, that even bacteria, even the microscopic organisms that normally decompose dead material within days or weeks, can only work at a crawl, taking years or decades to accomplish what they'd finish in a season near the surface. The cold, in this way, acts as a kind of preservative, not stopping time, but slowing it so dramatically that the distinction barely matters, creating an environment where change is so incremental, so spread out across such vast stretches of time, that nothing ever seems to happen, nothing ever seems to start or finish or reach completion, just continues in a state of almost suspended animation, neither alive nor dead, neither moving nor still, but existing in that liminal space between states, where the usual categories stop making sense. Silence fits naturally into that slowness, into that cold-induced lethargy, because sound requires energy, requires molecules to move faster than their resting state, to collide with enough force to transfer vibrations, and in water that's barely above freezing, where molecules are already moving as slowly as they can while remaining liquid, there's almost no excess energy available for anything else, no surplus motion that could be converted into sound, no disturbances vigorous enough to propagate through the dense cold medium that surrounds everything. The cold doesn't just make things quiet, it makes quietness inevitable, builds it into the very physics of the environment, ensures that even if something tried to generate noise, the cold would dampen it, would absorb the energy back into the thermal bath of near-freezing water, would restore equilibrium so quickly that the sound would die before it could travel, before it could establish itself as anything more than a momentary fluctuation in an otherwise unchanging field. Perhaps that's the real relationship between cold and silence. Not that one causes the other, but that they're both expressions of the same underlying condition, the same reduction in available energy, the same removal of the excess motion and heat and activity that characterize warmer, noisier places, leaving behind only what remains when almost everything has been subtracted, when the environment has cooled and settled and stabilized into its lowest energy state, which turns out to be a state of profound stillness, profound quiet, profound patience with time itself. The seafloor isn't flat the way we sometimes imagine it, isn't a featureless plain extending endlessly in all directions like some underwater desert. It has topography, contours, variations in elevation that rival anything on land, mountains that would dwarf Everest if they weren't submerged, ridges that run for thousands of miles marking the seams where tectonic plates pull apart, and trenches, long narrow depressions where the ocean floor drops away into depths that make the surrounding. Abyssal plains look shallow by comparison, places where the Earth's crust bends downward under the weight and force of plate tectonics, where one section of the planet's surface slides beneath another in a process so slow and so powerful that it creates these vast chasms, these scars in the seafloor that descend to depths most of the ocean never reaches, depths that exist in a category of their own, separated from the rest of the deep ocean, not just by additional meters of water, but by the sheer extremity of conditions, the way the pressure and cold and darkness intensify past the point where they've already become extreme, pushing into territory that feels less like an environment and more like a concept, more like the idea of depth carried to its logical conclusion. These places have a name, the hadal zone, named after Hades, the Greek underworld, which tells you something about how we think of them, how we've always thought of places that exist below our reach, below our understanding, in regions so remote and so removed from daily experience that they take on mythological qualities, become associated with the realm of the dead or the forgotten or the permanently inaccessible. The hadal zone begins at 6,000 meters, which is already deeper than the vast majority of the ocean, already well past the abyssal plains that make up most of the deep seafloor, and from there it extends downward to the very deepest points on Earth, places like the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, nearly 11,000 meters below sea level, or the Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, the Kermadec Trench, each of them a long, narrow wound in the ocean floor, a crack where the planet's surface has been forced downward by tectonic forces that never stop, that continue pushing and grinding and reshaping the crust on timescales that make human history look instantaneous, that operate with a patience and consistency that render individual earthquakes or volcanic eruptions into mere punctuation marks in a much longer, much slower story of planetary rearrangement. But numbers and names don't capture what these trenches are, not really. They're defined less by what they contain and more by what they don't contain, by the absence of everything that exists in shallower water, by the removal of features and conditions layer by layer until what's left is almost nothing. A void that happens to be filled with water but feels more like empty space, more like a gap in the world where the normal rules have been suspended and replaced with something starker, something closer to the vacuum of space than to the ocean we know from coastlines and beaches and surface swimming. You could drop Mount Everest into the Mariana Trench, and the summit would still be over a mile below the surface, still completely submerged, still invisible to anyone looking down from above. And that fact alone suggests the scale we're dealing with, the depth of absence that these trenches represent, the way they're not just deep, but profoundly deep, existentially deep, deep in a way that strains our ability to conceptualize vertical distance, because we have no frame of reference for what it means to be that far below anything, that far removed from the world of light and air and movement. And they're narrow, most of them, at least relative to their length. Trenches aren't gaping chasms, but rather elongated depressions, sometimes only a few dozen miles wide, but stretching for hundreds or even thousands of miles along the ocean floor, following the curve where one tectonic plate meets another, where the geometry of planetary collision creates these linear features that look, from above, like scratches or creases in the seafloor, like the Earth has been folded along certain lines. And the trench is the valley formed by that fold. The narrowness matters because it means there's not much horizontal space at the bottom, not much area for anything to exist or move around in. The trenches are confined spaces despite their depth, elongated tubes of extreme environment where the walls slope upward on either side, and the bottom is often just sediment, fine particles that have settled over millions of years, accumulating in the lowest point because there's nowhere else for them to go, creating a floor that's soft and undisturbed and featureless, a surface that hasn't been touched or disturbed or altered by anything except the slow, steady rain of material from above, falling grain by grain, molecule by molecule, adding imperceptible thickness to the bottom at a rate that would take centuries to measure in inches. Nothing visits these places, or almost nothing. There are a few species of fish adapted to hadal depths, a few amphipods and other small invertebrates that somehow survive down there despite the pressure and the cold and the complete absence of light. But their presence is so sparse, their numbers so small, their activity so minimal that calling them inhabitants feels like an overstatement, as if you could inhabit a void, as if you could make a home in a place that offers nothing, no food, sources except what drifts down from above, no shelter except the openness of the trench itself, no reason to be there except that evolution, through some series of improbable adaptations, has managed to push life into even this most extreme of environments. Though what that life looks like, how it experiences existence in a place so far removed from everything else, remains largely unknown because we've barely explored these depths, have sent down only a handful of manned and unmanned vehicles, have collected only the most fragmentary evidence of what exists there, and most of what we know comes from indirect observations, from instruments that measure conditions rather than experiencing them, from samples collected by probes that spend hours descending and only minutes on the bottom before beginning the long journey back to the surface. The trenches remain, in most meaningful ways, unmapped, unvisited, unknown except in the broadest outlines, which is perhaps fitting for places defined more by absence than presence, more by what isn't there than what is, where the dominant feature isn't the landscape or the life or the activity, but rather the silence, the stillness, the sense of a space so far from everything else that it exists almost in parallel to the rest of the planet, occupying the same sphere but functioning according to different principles, under different constraints, with a separateness so complete that it might as well be a different world entirely, one that tolerates nothing from the surface, nothing from the middle depths, nothing except what belongs there, which is almost nothing, which is the quiet itself. Waves don't reach down there. Not the surface waves we're familiar with, the ones that break on beaches and rock boats and carry energy across thousands of miles of open ocean, transferring momentum from wind to water in that visible, rhythmic rise and fall that defines the surface as a place of constant motion, constant change. Those waves are shallow water phenomena, surface effects that extend downward only a fraction of their wavelength, maybe a few dozen meters at most, even for the largest storm swells. And past that depth, their influence simply stops, dissipates into the surrounding water, becomes undetectable because the energy has been distributed across so much volume that it no longer constitutes movement, no longer creates the back and forth oscillation we recognize as wave action. At the bottom of a trench, 7 or 8 or 10 miles down, the ocean's surface might as well not exist. Storms could be raging up there, hurricanes spinning with enough force to generate waves 40 or 50 feet high, and none of it would matter, none of it would penetrate, none of it would reach the depths where pressure and distance have created an environment so removed from surface conditions that the two realms share almost nothing except the fact that they're both water, both part of the same planetary ocean, though separated by a vertical distance that functions as an absolute barrier to energy transfer, to influence, to any kind of connection between what happens above and what exists below. Currents, too, are mostly absent, At least the kind of currents we think of when we imagine water flowing. The swift surface currents like the Gulf Stream or the Kuroshio, moving at speeds of several miles per hour, transporting water across ocean basins, redistributing heat from equator to poles, creating the circulation patterns that moderate climate and support marine ecosystems. Those currents exist in the upper layers, driven by wind and by the Coriolis effect, and by differences in temperature and salinity that create density gradients. And while some deep currents do exist, moving along the bottom as part of the global thermohaline circulation, they're so slow, so barely detectable, that calling them currents feels generous. They're more like a gradual drift, water moving at speeds measured in centimeters per hour, taking decades to cross distances that surface. Currents cover in weeks, and even these sluggish flows tend to follow the major basins and ridges, avoiding the trenches, bypassing the deepest depressions, because water that sinks to hadal depths tends to stay there, trapped by its own density, too heavy to rise, too cold to gain the buoyancy that might lift it back toward the surface, just sitting in place or moving so imperceptibly that the difference between flowing water and still water becomes impossible to determine without instruments, sensitive enough to detect displacements of millimeters per day. Seasons don't exist down there, not in any form we'd recognize. No summer warming the water, no winter cooling it, no spring bloom of phytoplankton responding to increased sunlight, no autumn die-off as light levels decline and nutrients become scarce. The temperature stays constant year-round, locked at those few degrees above freezing, unchanging, because the water is too deep to be affected by surface temperatures, too insulated by the layers above to ever feel the sun's influence, existing in a perpetual winter that isn't actually winter because there's no other season to contrast it against, just a permanent cold that defines the baseline, the default state, the only state that depth allows. And without seasons, without the cyclical changes that mark time on land and in shallow water, there's no rhythm to life down there, no annual patterns of reproduction or migration or hibernation, no calendar of biological events that might create pulses of activity, moments when things happen at higher frequencies, when the normal stillness gives way to something more dynamic, more concentrated, more noticeable. If life exists at these depths, and it does, barely, it operates on timescales that have nothing to do with Earth's orbit around the sun, nothing to do with the tilt of the axis or the changing angle of sunlight or any of the astronomical factors that organize life into temporal patterns everywhere else, following instead some other rhythm, some slower cycle tied to the availability of food drifting down from above, or to internal biological clocks that measure time in years rather than months, in decades rather than seasons, in intervals so extended that an entire human lifetime might pass between significant events in the life of a single organism. Daylight, obviously, has never touched the hadal zone and never will. The sun's radiation gets absorbed and scattered long before it reaches even the upper edges of the deep ocean, and the trenches lie so far beyond the photic zone, so far past the depth where photosynthesis becomes impossible, that they exist in a permanent midnight that's never been interrupted, never been broken by even a single photon of sunlight since the trenches formed millions of years ago. That darkness is total, absolute, unrelieved by any natural light source, except the occasional bioluminescence of the few creatures that live there, though even that's rare, a flash here and there, a momentary glow that serves some purpose we can only guess at, attracting prey, confusing predators, communicating with potential mates, before fading back into the blackness that surrounds everything, that fills every space, that defines the visual environment as completely as pressure defines the physical one. And in darkness that complete, in the absence of any light that might create shadows or contrasts, or the sense of space that vision provides, the lack of sound becomes even more pronounced, more noticeable, because we're accustomed to using multiple senses to understand our surroundings, to triangulate position and distance in the presence of objects or organisms nearby. And when sight is removed entirely, when vision becomes not just difficult, but impossible, we become more dependent on hearing, more attuned to acoustic information, more aware of what we can or cannot detect through sound. And in the hadal zone, the answer is nothing. There's nothing to hear because nothing is making noise. Nothing is moving fast enough or colliding with enough force to generate vibrations that would propagate as sound waves. And so the silence persists, not just as background, but as foreground, as the primary characteristic of the environment, the thing you'd notice first if you could somehow be there to notice anything at all. Maybe absence, when it's this complete, when it's layered this deeply, no waves, no currents, no seasons, no light, no sound, stops being the removal of things and becomes something in itself, becomes a presence rather than a lack, something that occupies space and defines character and creates an environment as surely as the presence of those elements would create a different kind of environment, a different kind of place. There's movement in the deep ocean, though calling it movement might be too generous, might suggest something more active than what actually occurs. It's more like a gradual settling, a slow drift downward of particles so small and so light that they barely qualify as objects, more like suspended matter, like dust in water, except this dust is organic, fragments of dead plankton and fecal matter and bits of larger creatures that have died and begun to decompose, all of it falling, always. Falling, pulled by gravity through the water column, at speeds so slow that it takes weeks or months for a single particle to make the journey from surface to sea floor, descending through mile after mile of water in a process that feels less like falling and more like floating, like hovering, like existing in a state of perpetual almost motion, where the difference between moving and not moving becomes impossible to determine without watching for hours or days or longer. Scientists call it marine snow, which is an apt name, evocative in the way it suggests both the appearance and the behavior of these particles, the way they drift and tumble and catch what little light exists in the upper layers, creating something that looks, from a distance, like a gentle snowfall, like flakes descending through air, except this is water and the flakes are so sparse, so widely distributed, that you might see one particle every few seconds, every few minutes, depending on depth and location and the productivity of the surface waters above. Most of this material never makes it to the bottom. It gets consumed on the way down, eaten by fish or invertebrates or bacteria that intercept it at various depths, breaking it down, recycling the nutrients, incorporating the carbon and nitrogen and other elements back into living tissue, so that what started as a dead cell at the surface might pass through dozens of organisms before finally reaching the seafloor. And by then, it's been reduced, transformed, broken into smaller and smaller pieces until only the most resistant compounds remain, the ones that can't be easily digested, that survive the journey through multiple digestive systems and still maintain enough structural integrity to continue falling. By the time marine snow reaches hadal depths, it's been filtered and processed and depleted of almost everything valuable, almost everything that could serve as food or energy, leaving only the dregs, the remnants, the molecular fragments that nothing else wanted or could use. And even these scarce leftovers fall so slowly that their descent is measured not in feet per second or even feet per minute, but in something more like feet per hour, perhaps slower, drifting downward at a pace that makes geological processes look rapid, that makes tectonic movement seem hasty, that stretches the act of falling across such extended durations that it stops feeling like an event and becomes more like a state of being, a condition that particles enter and remain in for timescales that dwarf any individual human observation. If you could watch a single particle of marine snow descending through the hadal zone, could somehow mark it and follow it and observe its progress without disturbing it, you'd see almost nothing happening. The particle would appear suspended in the darkness, held in place by forces you can't see, moving so incrementally that even time-lapse photography might fail to capture the motion unless it compressed days or weeks into seconds, and even then the movement would be subtle, ambiguous, difficult to distinguish from simple drift caused by currents too weak to measure, caused by microscopic eddies created by temperature variations too small to detect, caused by the random molecular motion of water itself, which at this scale, at this level of magnification, never quite stops moving even when it appears perfectly still. The particle doesn't fall in a straight line. It tumbles, rotates, shifts laterally as it descends, following a path that's more like a three-dimensional random walk than a trajectory, influenced by its shape and its density, and the microscopic variations in water properties that change from 1 cubic centimeter to the next, creating a journey that's as much about lateral drift as vertical descent, so that a particle might take months to fall, a few hundred meters, might wander horizontally, across miles of seafloor before finally settling, might trace a path through the water that's impossibly convoluted, impossibly inefficient, as if gravity itself operates differently down there, as if the pull toward the center of the Earth has become so diffuse, so weakened by the intervening mass of water, that particles respond to it only reluctantly, only when no other forces are acting, only in the absence of any reason not to fall. And in that slowness, in that near suspension, the marine snow becomes part of the silence, becomes another element of the stillness that defines these depths, because movement this gradual doesn't generate sound, doesn't create vibrations, doesn't disturb the water in any way that would propagate as acoustic energy. The particles drift without sound, without friction, without any of the noise that normally accompanies falling objects, settling through the water as quietly as they would through a vacuum, maybe more quietly because the water dampens even the molecular level interactions that might otherwise create infinitesimal pressure variations, absorbing any potential disturbance back into the medium before it can become something detectable, something that might register as sound to anything capable of hearing. The descent is silent, has always been silent, will always be silent regardless of how many particles are falling at any given moment, regardless of how much material is making this slow journey, from light to darkness, from surface to floor. Because the scale is wrong for sound, the speed is wrong. The forces involved are too weak and too diffuse and too gradual to ever cross the threshold where motion becomes audible, where mechanical action translates into acoustic waves, where something happening in the physical world creates a corresponding signature in the acoustic realm. What reaches the bottom, eventually, after all that time and all that distance and all that processing and filtering and consumption along the way, is almost nothing. A thin layer of sediment accumulating at rates measured in millimeters per millennium, building up so slowly that the seafloor essentially doesn't change from year to year, from decade to decade, from century to century, remaining as it was, as it has been, as it will continue to be for as long as the ocean exists, and particles continue their patient descent through the water column above. And perhaps that's the real significance of marine snow in the context of silence, not that it makes noise or fails to make noise, but that it represents the only form of motion that exists at these depths, the only thing that moves with any consistency, with any directionality, and yet it moves so slowly, so quietly, so unobtrusively that it might as well be motionless, might as well be part of the stillness rather than a departure from it, contributing to the sense that nothing ever happens. Here, nothing ever changes, nothing ever disturbs the equilibrium that the deep ocean has maintained for longer than most mountains have existed on land. Pressure, at the surface, is something we barely notice. We live under roughly 15 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure, the weight of all the air above us pressing down constantly, but we've adapted to it so completely that we only become aware of it when it changes. When we climb a mountain or fly in an airplane or descend into a deep mine and our ears pop, our sinuses ache, our bodies register the differential and remind us that we exist within a fluid, that we're surrounded by a medium that has weight and exerts force even though we've learned to ignore it. Water is heavier than air, much heavier, roughly 800 times denser, and every 10 meters of depth adds another atmosphere of pressure, another 15 pounds per square inch stacking on top of what's already there, compounding, accumulating, building toward pressures that seem impossible until you realize they're not just possible but inevitable, not exceptional, but simply what happens when you have miles of water sitting above you, when gravity pulls all that mass downward, and there's nowhere for it to go except into the space you occupy, pressing inward from every direction simultaneously, creating a force so evenly distributed, so perfectly uniform, that it doesn't crush so much as contain, doesn't destroy so much as hold everything in a kind of suspended equilibrium where nothing can move because movement would require creating a pressure differential, would require pushing against the surrounding water, and the water pushes back with a force measured in tons per square inch, 8 tons, 10 tons, more than most materials can withstand, more than most structures can resist, but exactly the right amount to still everything, to make motion costly enough that it rarely occurs, to enforce a kind of physical calm that mirrors the acoustic silence, that reinforces it, that makes the two inseparable aspects of the same fundamental condition. At the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the pressure reaches approximately 16,000 pounds per square inch, roughly 1,000 times greater than atmospheric pressure at sea level, and those numbers are difficult to grasp in any visceral way. We don't have experience with forces that large applied uniformly across surfaces, can't really imagine what it would feel like to be pressed that hard from all sides at once. Though the answer is, it would feel like nothing because you wouldn't survive long enough to feel anything. Your body would fail catastrophically. Airspaces would collapse. Tissues would compress. The structural integrity that keeps you recognizably human would give way under pressure that treats bone and flesh and blood as barely more resistant than the water itself. But that's the human scale response, the vulnerability of organisms adapted to one atmosphere dealing with 1,000 atmospheres. And it's not how pressure works for things that belong there, for creatures that evolved under those conditions, that never knew anything different, that have no airspaces to collapse, no rigid structures to fail, no cavities or voids that could be compressed, because everything in their bodies is as incompressible as water, is mostly water, exists in pressure. Equilibrium with the surrounding environment so that the force pushing outward equals the force pushing inward, and the net result is zero, is neutrality, is a state where pressure exists but doesn't act because there's nothing for it to act on, no gradient, no difference, no reason for force to translate into motion or deformation or change. And maybe that's what pressure does at these depths. It doesn't so much crush things as it eliminates the possibility of disturbance, creates an environment where everything is held so firmly, so uniformly, that any deviation from equilibrium requires enormous energy, requires overcoming forces that most processes can't generate, that most events can't produce, leaving only stillness, only stability, only the kind of profound quiet that comes from a system that's been compressed into its lowest energy state and has no reason to leave it, no pathway back toward anything more active, more dynamic, more capable of generating the mechanical disturbances we recognize as sound. Pressure, in this sense, is the mechanism that enforces silence, the physical foundation beneath the acoustic phenomenon, the reason that even if something did try to make noise down there, even if a rock fell, or a creature moved, or two surfaces rubbed together, the sound would be dampened immediately, absorbed by water so dense and so resistant to vibration that it functions almost like a solid, almost like something that can't transmit waves because the molecules are packed so tightly, held so firmly in place by the weight above them, that they can't oscillate with the freedom required for sound propagation, can't move back and forth in the rhythmic way that allows acoustic energy to travel, can only transmit the most minimal vibrations before the energy dissipates into the general pressure field, becomes just another increment of the force that's already there, indistinguishable from the background, undetectable, silent. The uniformity matters enormously. Pressure that varied from place to place would create gradients, would drive flow, would generate currents as water moved from high-pressure regions toward low-pressure regions in an attempt to equalize, and those currents would create turbulence and friction and all the mechanical processes that produce sound. But in the hadal zone, the pressure is as uniform as nature allows, varying only slightly with the minor topographic differences in the seafloor. A few meters of elevation change here or there, translating into negligible pressure differences, fractions of a percent, insufficient to drive any meaningful flow, any sustained movement, any process that might disturb the stillness. The water sits under its own weight, each layer supporting the ones above, each molecule surrounded by other molecules, all experiencing the same force, all locked into the same condition, all equally unable to move except in the most minimal ways. the random thermal motion that persists even at near freezing temperatures, but contributes nothing to bulk flow, nothing to organized movement, nothing that could create sound or propagate disturbance or break the silence that pressure maintains, not through active suppression, but through simple physics, through the mathematics of force and equilibrium, and the fact that when everything is pressed equally from all directions, nothing has anywhere to go. No direction in which movement would encounter less resistance, no pathway toward change that doesn't require energy inputs far beyond what's naturally available at those depths. Perhaps pressure is the final element, the last piece needed to understand why the bottom of the ocean is silent. Because we've seen the absence of light, the removal of surface influences, the cold that slows everything, the density that resists flow, the lack of biological activity that might generate noise. But beneath all of that, enabling all of that, making all of it possible and permanent and inescapable, is the pressure itself, the sheer weight of water pressing down from miles above, creating conditions so extreme that they exclude almost everything except stillness, almost everything except quiet, leaving a place where silence isn't maintained through any active process, but simply through the fundamental nature of the environment, through the fact that under that much pressure, under that much weight, under that much force distributed so evenly across every surface and through every volume, nothing can move easily, nothing can disturb equilibrium, nothing can generate the vibrations that would constitute sound, and so the quiet persists, not as something fragile that needs protection, but as something solid, something built into the structure of the place itself, as permanent and unchangeable as the pressure that creates it. Life, even here, even at depths that seem designed to exclude it, persists in forms so minimal, so reduced, so thoroughly adapted to extremity that they barely register as living in the way we usually understand the term. They don't move much, don't grow much, don't reproduce frequently, or consume resources at rates that would seem sustainable anywhere else, but instead exist in a kind of suspended metabolic state, operating at the absolute minimum level required to maintain the chemical processes that separate living tissue from dead matter, burning energy so slowly that a year in their existence might be equivalent to a day for a surface organism, stretching time out across such extended durations that their entire lives, birth to death, could span decades or centuries, and we wouldn't know because we've barely begun to study them, have only recently developed the technology to reach these depths and observe what lives there. And even then our observations are fragmentary, brief visits by probes that spend hours descending and minutes on the bottom before returning to the surface, catching only glimpses of creatures that might spend their entire existence within a few square meters of sea floor, never wandering, never migrating, never moving except when absolutely necessary, because movement costs energy, and energy is the scarcest resource in an environment where almost nothing drifts down from above, where the marine snow that represents food arrives in such sparse quantities, in such depleted form, that organisms have learned to survive on almost nothing, to extract every possible calorie from every particle, to wait patiently between meals that might come days or weeks apart. The creatures that exist here are small, mostly, amphipods and other crustaceans a few centimeters long, fish with soft bodies and slow metabolisms, occasionally something larger but still unimpressive by surface standards, still adapted to conserve rather than expend, to minimize rather than maximize, to exist as efficiently as possible in a place where efficiency isn't an advantage but a requirement, where anything that uses more energy than absolutely necessary would simply starve, would burn through its reserves faster than it could replenish them, would fail to survive in an ecosystem where success is measured not by growth or reproduction or territorial expansion, but by simple persistence, by the ability to remain alive in conditions that barely permit life at all. They're translucent, many of them, lacking the pigmentation that organisms use in lighted environments because color serves no purpose in total darkness, offers no benefit for camouflage or display, or any of the visual communication strategies that matter near the surface, and so evolution has removed it, has stripped away everything unnecessary, everything that costs energy to produce or maintain, leaving only the essential structures, the minimum biology required to qualify as a functioning organism. And even those structures are often reduced, simplified, altered in ways that make them almost unrecognizable compared to their shallow water relatives. They move, when they move at all, with a slowness that matches everything else about these depths. There are no sudden darts, no quick escapes, no chases or pursuits, or any of the dynamic interactions that characterize predator-prey relationships in more energetic environments. Just slow drifting, occasional positioning adjustments, movements measured in body lengths per minute, rather than per second, as if everything happens underwater, even though they already are underwater, as if the medium itself has somehow become thicker, more resistant, more reluctant to allow passage, which in a sense it has because of the pressure and the density and the cold, but also because these creatures have no reason to hurry, no advantage gained from speed, no threats that require rapid response because even the predators here are slow. Even the hunters operate on timescales that make ambush seem hasty, that make pursuit seem inefficient, preferring instead to wait for food to come to them, to position themselves in the path of falling particles or drifting prey, and simply open their mouths, letting gravity and current, such as it is, deliver whatever nutrition happens to be available, however meager that might be. Their presence doesn't disturb the silence. They're too small, too slow, too infrequent in their movements to generate sound, to create vibrations that would propagate through the water as acoustic energy. And even if they did make noise, even if their movements or feeding or occasional interactions produce some kind of mechanical disturbance, it would be so faint, so minimal, so quickly dampened by the dense water surrounding them that it wouldn't travel, wouldn't carry, wouldn't reach beyond the immediate vicinity before dissipating completely, becoming part of the background pressure variations that occur constantly at molecular scales, but never accumulate into anything that could be called sound, anything that could be detected or measured or experienced as noise. In a way, these creatures are extensions of the silence rather than interruptions of it, embodiments of what it means to exist in a place where quietness is mandatory, where the environment enforces a kind of stillness that applies to biology as much as physics, where life has been shaped by the same forces that create and maintain the acoustic void, where evolution has selected for organisms that fit seamlessly into the prevailing conditions, rather than challenging them or resisting them, or creating pockets of activity that stand apart from the background calm. They exist almost as proof that silence and life aren't mutually exclusive, that you can have biological processes, metabolism, growth, reproduction, all the characteristics we associate with living things, and still maintain an environment where nothing makes noise, where nothing disturbs the acoustic equilibrium, where the presence of organisms doesn't translate into the presence of sound, because the organisms themselves have become quiet, have adapted to move silently, to feed silently, to exist without generating the mechanical disturbances that would, in other environments, be inevitable consequences of being alive, of occupying space, of interacting with the physical world in ways that require force and motion and the displacement of water. Perhaps what's most striking about life in the hadal zone isn't that it exists despite the silence, but that it exists within the silence as part of it, contributing to it in its own way by demonstrating that even biological activity, even the processes of living and feeding and surviving, can occur without breaking the quiet, without adding sound to an environment that has none. And maybe that suggests something about the nature of silence itself, that it's not fragile, not easily disrupted, not something that exists only in the absence of life, but something that can coexist with life, can accommodate it, can allow organisms to inhabit a space without requiring them to make noise, without demanding that their presence be announced or their activities be audible, leaving them free to exist as quietly as the water around them, as still as the sediment beneath them, as silent as the darkness that has always surrounded them and always will. Humans have barely touched these places, have barely visited them even in the most technical sense of visiting, of sending physical presence to a location, even if that presence is enclosed in metal, and protected from the environment it's attempting to observe. Fewer people have descended to the deepest parts of the ocean than have walked on the moon. Fewer have reached the Challenger Deep than have summited Everest. And while space travel captures public imagination and generates headlines and feels like the frontier of human exploration, the ocean floor remains largely unknown, largely unvisited, largely existing in a state of pristine isolation that has nothing to do with intentional preservation and everything to do with simple inaccessibility, with the technical difficulty of building vessels that can withstand the pressure, with the cost and complexity of mounting expeditions that take hours just to reach the bottom and hours more to return, with the fact that the deep ocean, despite covering most of Earth's surface, despite containing more volume than all the atmosphere above it, has resisted human intrusion more successfully than almost any other environment we've tried to explore. The first manned descent to the Challenger Deep happened in 1960, almost 2 decades before the first space shuttle flight. And yet in the decades since, only a handful of people have repeated that journey, have enclosed themselves in submersibles and descended through miles of darkening water toward the bottom. And even they saw only what their lights illuminated, only the small circle of seafloor visible through viewports, spending minutes or hours in a place that extends for thousands of square miles, observing a tiny fraction of an environment that, for the most part, exists without observers, without witnesses, without any human awareness of what's happening there, or what has happened there, or what will continue to happen there long after we've stopped trying to reach it. The technology required is extraordinary. Submersibles designed for hadal exploration need hulls that can resist pressure measured in tons per square inch, need systems that function reliably in conditions where a single failure would be catastrophic, where a crack or leak or malfunction would result in implosion so rapid that occupants would never know what happened, would cease to exist in the time it takes sound to cross a room, which ironically is faster than sound crosses through that depth. Of water, but still instantaneous from any human perspective. And the engineering challenges involved in creating vessels capable of surviving that environment, of protecting human life inside a sphere of metal or ceramic, while everything outside presses inward with forces that could flatten cars, means that these expeditions are rare, expensive, limited in duration and scope, unable to accomplish more than brief surveys, quick collections of samples or video footage or measurements that represent snapshots rather than comprehensive studies, moments rather than sustained observation, leaving most of the deep ocean as unknown after the visit as it was before, touched briefly by human technology but unchanged, unaffected, continuing its existence in the same silence and darkness and pressure that defined it long before anyone thought to explore it, and will define it long after exploration becomes too expensive, too difficult, too marginal to justify the resources required. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the deep ocean should remain largely unvisited, not because we're choosing to preserve it, but because it preserves itself, protects itself through simple physics, through the hostile conditions that make human presence difficult enough that only the most determined attempts succeed. Only the most carefully planned expeditions manage to reach the bottom and return with anything useful, leaving behind an environment that functions for all practical purposes, as if humans don't exist, as if our species occupies only the surface layers, the bright, warm, shallow regions where life is abundant and movement is easy and sound propagates readily, while below that, in the deep layers that make up most of the ocean's volume, existence continues without us, without our influence, without our noise or our presence or our attempts to map and measure and understand, just persisting in the state it's always been in, the state it will return to once our brief visits end and the submersibles ascend and the lights switch off and the darkness reclaims everything we temporarily illuminated, erasing all evidence of our presence within moments, within hours, certainly within years, as sediment settles and whatever marks we left, track marks from cameras or sample collectors, disturbances in the silt, get covered over, get incorporated back into the seafloor, become indistinguishable from the surface they briefly interrupted. The silence exists partly because we're not there to hear it, but more fundamentally because we're not there to break it, not there to add our machinery and our movement and our inevitable production of sound to an environment that has none. And the rarity of human visits means the silence remains mostly undisturbed, mostly pure, mostly what it would be if humans had never evolved or never developed the capability to reach these depths. And there's something humbling in that, something that puts our exploration efforts in perspective, because we like to think of ourselves as having mastered the planet, as having reached every corner and mapped every surface and left our mark on every environment. But the deep ocean exists as a counterexample, as a place that remains largely beyond our reach, despite decades of trying, despite technological advances that let us split atoms and sequence genomes and send probes to the edge of the solar system. And maybe that's what these places are, reminders that Earth still has regions we haven't conquered, haven't tamed, haven't made familiar through repeated visits and sustained presence, regions that remain alien in the truest sense, as unknown and as remote as any landscape on another planet. Except they're here. They're part of our own world, separated from us, not by the vastness of space, but by the vertical distance between surface and floor, by the simple fact that we can't easily go there, can't survive there without. Technology that's barely reliable enough to attempt can't stay long enough to do more than scratch the surface of understanding, leaving the deep ocean as one of Earth's last truly remote places. Last places that exist primarily without human witness, without human interference, without human presence to observe or document or alter what would otherwise continue unchanged, unnoticed, silent as it's always been, silent as it will remain, regardless of whether anyone is there to hear it or not. The seafloor at these depths is old in a way that's difficult to conceptualize, not just old in the sense of having existed for a long time, but old in the sense of being unchanged, unmodified, sitting in essentially the same configuration it has occupied for millions of years, accumulating sediment so slowly that the surface visible today looks almost identical to the surface that existed when early humans were first learning to walk upright, when continents were in different positions, when the climate was different and sea levels were different. An entire species that dominated the planet have since gone extinct while the bottom of the ocean remained as it was, patient, unmoving, indifferent to everything happening in the layers above it or on the land masses that rise out of those layers, just continuing its existence at the pace that geology operates, which is to say, almost imperceptibly, changes measured not in years or decades, but in epochs, in periods, in stretches of time, so long that human history becomes a footnote, human civilization becomes a moment, and the entire span of recorded human experience becomes a blink in comparison to the timescales involved in building mountains, or eroding coastlines, or depositing enough sediment on the ocean floor to raise it by a single meter. Sediment arrives slowly, has always arrived slowly, particle by particle through the marine snow that drifts down from above. And while we talked about that descent earlier, about the gradual falling of organic debris through the water column, what matters for the seafloor is what happens after that material lands, after it settles onto the bottom and becomes part of the surface rather than part of the water. And the answer is almost nothing happens. The particles sit where they landed, undisturbed by currents because there are no meaningful currents, unmoved by organisms because the few organisms that exist don't burrow or excavate or rearrange sediment the way shallow water creatures do, just rest on top of it or move across it so carefully, so minimally, that they leave almost no trace, no tracks that persist, no evidence of their passage except perhaps in the most detailed examination of the surface layer. And even that evidence disappears quickly as new particles arrive. As the slow accumulation continues, as the seafloor rises imperceptibly, gaining perhaps a few millimeters per 1,000 years in the deep basins, maybe slightly more in trenches where material might collect preferentially, but still at rates so slow that the change is invisible, not just to human observation, but to most forms of measurement, requiring specialized techniques and decades of data collection to detect any difference at all. The sediment itself is mostly inorganic by the time it reaches these depths, Whatever organic components survived the journey have been so thoroughly processed, so completely broken down by the consumption and decomposition that occurred during descent, that what remains is primarily clay particles, mineral grains, the microscopic shells of planktonic organisms that died near the surface and made it all the way down intact because their calcium carbonate or silica structures resist dissolution. Better than soft tissue, though even those shells accumulate slowly, building up layers that geologists can core and examine to read backwards through time, to see what conditions existed in surface waters thousands or millions of years ago based on the species composition and isotopic signatures preserved in the sediment, turning the ocean floor into an archive, a record of planetary history written in particles so small you need a microscope to identify them, compressed and compacted by the weight of subsequent layers into something that approaches stone, something that will eventually, over tens or hundreds of millions of years, become sedimentary rock, become part of the geological record that persists even after the ocean itself has changed, even after the basins have shifted and the continents have moved, and the water has been redistributed across different parts of the planet's surface. But that transformation, that lithification, happens at timescales that make the current accumulation seem rapid, that push us into deep time where millions of years are normal intervals, where the relevant processes operate so slowly that calling them processes feels wrong, feels like it implies too much activity, too much dynamism, when really what's happening is just continuation, just persistence, just the steady, inevitable progression of geological forces that never speed up, never slow down, never respond to anything happening on human timescales or even biological timescales, just continue at their own pace, indifferent to everything except the fundamental physics that governs how matter behaves under pressure over time. The seafloor doesn't erode the way land surfaces erode. There's no rain to wash material away, no wind to carry particles elsewhere, no freeze-thaw cycles to crack rock, no plant roots to break apart structures, no seasonal flooding to redistribute sediment, just the constant weight of water pressing down uniformly, preserving whatever configuration exists, protecting it from the forces that reshape other environments, creating a kind of geological stability that's rare on Earth, a place where the surface you see has looked essentially the same, not just for years, but for geological periods, for stretches of time that encompass the entire evolution of modern humans, the entire Pleistocene epoch, possibly reaching back into the Pliocene or beyond, depending on location, on tectonic activity, on whether the particular section of seafloor you're looking at has been undisturbed long enough to accumulate that much history without being recycled through subduction zones or disrupted by underwater landslides or affected by any of the relatively rare events that can alter deep ocean topography. And in that stability, in that geological stillness, there's a different kind of silence, not acoustic but temporal, a quietness that comes from nothing changing, from the absence of events, from the way time passes without marking itself, without leaving evidence of its passage, except in the accumulation of sediment too thin to see year by year, too gradual to measure without instruments sensitive enough to detect differences of micrometers. And even then, you need to wait, need to take measurements separated by decades to have any chance of seeing the change, of confirming that accumulation is actually occurring and not just theoretically occurring, not just something we infer from geological principles, but something we can document through repeated observation of the same location over time spans that exceed most scientific careers, most research programs, most institutional commitments to long-term monitoring, which is why so much of what we know about sedimentation rates comes from indirect evidence, from cores and samples that let us look backwards rather than watching forward, that show us the result of millions of years of accumulation, but don't let us witness the process as it happens, because the process is too slow to witness, operates at a pace that's invisible, not just to casual observation, but to dedicated study, unless you're willing to commit generations of researchers to the task, to establish monitoring programs that outlast the people who started them and continue through changes in technology and scientific priorities and funding availability, maintaining consistency across decades or centuries to accumulate enough data points to say anything definitive about processes that operate at geological speeds, that move at the pace of the planet rather than the pace of human activity. Perhaps the seafloor's stillness, its geological patience, contributes to the acoustic silence not directly, but conceptually, not by preventing sound, but by embodying a kind of time that's incompatible with noise, that exists at scales where sound becomes irrelevant, where vibrations that last seconds or minutes don't register because the relevant changes happen over millennia, where even sustained sounds that persist for years would be too brief to matter in the context of processes that measure duration in millions of years, leaving a place where silence isn't just the absence of sound, but the absence of the kind of time in which sound makes sense, the kind of rapid change and immediate causation that acoustic phenomena require, replaced instead with a temporal landscape where everything is slow enough, stable enough, still enough that adding sound would feel like an intrusion, not just acoustically, but temporally, a disruption of rhythms that operate at frequencies too low for human perception, too slow for human measurement, too patient for anything except the planet itself to notice or care about. Silence, when it's this complete, when it exists not as the temporary absence of noise but as a fundamental characteristic of a place, starts to feel less like emptiness and more like presence, less like what's missing and more like what's there, occupying space the way matter occupies space, filling the environment with something that isn't quite nothing, even though it resists definition, resists measurement, resists all the usual ways we try to understand what exists and what doesn't exist in the physical world. We're accustomed to thinking of silence as negative space, as the gap between sounds, as what remains when everything that could make noise has stopped making noise. But that understanding assumes silence is passive, assumes it's just waiting to be filled, waiting for sound to arrive and claim the space it temporarily vacates. And maybe that's true in most places, in most environments where silence is fragile and temporary, and easily broken by the slightest disturbance. But in the hadal zone, in the deepest trenches where we've been dwelling for these past thousands of words, silence isn't waiting for anything, isn't temporary, isn't something that can be broken or filled or replaced, because it's built into the structure of the place itself, woven into the physics and the chemistry and the biology, inseparable from the pressure and the cold and the darkness, existing as a permanent feature rather than a temporary condition. And that permanence changes what it means, changes how we might think about it if we spent enough time considering what it's like for a place to be fundamentally, irreversibly quiet. What does silence hold, if anything? Not in the sense of what physical objects or organisms exist within it. We've already talked about the sparse life, the sediment, the water itself, but in the sense of what qualities, what possibilities, what aspects of existence become available or accessible in the complete absence of acoustic information. In an environment where hearing, if you could somehow be there to hear, would provide no information at all, would connect you to nothing, would tell you nothing about your surroundings because your surroundings aren't generating any signals worth detecting, aren't producing any vibrations that could be interpreted as meaningful sound. In spaces where noise is constant, where the acoustic environment is rich with information, footsteps approaching, voices carrying meaning, machinery indicating activity, nature producing its endless variations on wind and water and biological interaction, silence is notable because it represents a departure, an interruption of the normal state, and we notice it precisely because it's unusual, because something that should be making noise has stopped, and that absence tells us something, warns us, makes us more alert to other forms of information, other senses that might explain why the usual sounds have disappeared. But in places where silence is the baseline, where it's not an interruption but the default condition, where nothing has ever made noise and nothing ever will, the relationship between organism and acoustic environment changes completely, becomes something we can barely imagine because we've never experienced it, never lived in a place where hearing is functionally useless, where the capacity to detect vibrations in a medium offers no advantage, provides no information, serves no purpose except, perhaps, to remind you that the medium exists but has nothing to say. And maybe that's what makes the silence at the bottom of the ocean so different from any silence we can experience on land. The fact that it's not about the absence of specific sounds or the removal of particular noise sources, but about the fundamental disconnection between the physical world and the acoustic realm. The way the environment has arranged itself so that sound isn't suppressed or dampened or reduced, but simply doesn't arise in the first place, doesn't exist as a possibility because nothing is happening that would generate it. Nothing is moving with sufficient force or speed or irregularity to create the kind of mechanical disturbance that would propagate as waves through a medium, leaving an environment where the mechanisms that produce sound in other places have been removed entirely, where you could wait forever and nothing would break the quiet, because nothing can break the quiet. Nothing has the energy or the means or the reason to disturb an equilibrium that's maintained by forces far more powerful than anything that might challenge it. There's something almost philosophical about that, about silence that exists, not because someone chose to be quiet, or because circumstances temporarily favor quiet, but because the universe, in this particular location, under these particular conditions, has arranged matter and energy in a way that makes noise impossible, that excludes sound from the set of possible phenomena, that creates an environment where one of the fundamental ways we experience and understand the world simply doesn't apply, doesn't function, doesn't have any relevance to existence as it occurs there. Perhaps what silence holds, then, isn't something we can point to or measure or describe in physical terms, but rather a kind of space, a conceptual space, where certain forms of interaction and communication and awareness become unnecessary, where the absence of one sense doesn't create deprivation, but rather opens up a different mode of existing, a different relationship with the environment that doesn't depend on constant input, constant stimulation, constant streams of information telling you what's happening nearby or far away or approaching or receding. The deep ocean, in its silence, models a kind of existence that's unimaginable to most life on Earth, to organisms that evolved in acoustic environments and developed hearing as a survival mechanism, as a way to detect predators, or find prey, or communicate with their own species. But down there, in the trenches, in the places where pressure and cold and darkness have eliminated almost everything we associate with active living, silence isn't an obstacle to be overcome, or a challenge to be adapted to. It's simply the medium, the background, the condition under which everything else occurs, as fundamental and unavoidable as the water itself, and organisms that live there presumably don't experience it as silence in the way we would, because they have no contrast, no memory of noise, no expectation that the world should sound like anything, just accept the absence of acoustic information the way we accept the presence of gravity, as something so basic, so intrinsic to existence that it never occurs to us to question it or wonder what life would be like without it. And maybe there's something in that acceptance, that lack of resistance to conditions that seem extreme only from an outside perspective, that suggests silence isn't about what's missing, but about what's allowed when certain forms of stimulation are removed, when the constant acoustic bombardment that characterizes most environments is stripped away and replaced with nothing, with pure quiet, with an absence so complete that it stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like its own kind of presence, its own kind of reality, its own valid way for an environment to exist. And perhaps the question isn't what silence holds, but what silence allows, what becomes possible when there's no sound to distract or disturb or demand attention, when the world simply is without announcing itself, without declaring its presence through vibration and pressure waves and all the mechanical phenomena we've learned to interpret as meaningful, leaving instead just existence in its most basic form, matter arranged in space, following physical laws, continuing through time without narration, without commentary, without any acoustic evidence that anything is happening at all, even though everything is happening, even though processes continue and molecules move and energy flows and the slow work of the planet proceeds exactly as it always has, just quietly, patiently, without feeling any need to make itself heard. We carry noise with us everywhere we go, not just the obvious external sounds of traffic and conversation and machinery, but the internal noise as well, the constant mental chatter, the stream of thoughts and worries and plans that runs through consciousness whether we want it to or not, creating a kind of acoustic environment inside our heads that mirrors the acoustic environment outside them, never quite stopping, never quite settling, always processing, always commenting, always generating. Some form of mental activity that feels, in its own way, like sound, even though it makes no vibration, produces no pressure waves, exists only in the neurological realm where thoughts arise and dissolve and get replaced by other thoughts in a cycle that continues from waking to sleeping, and sometimes even through sleep itself when dreams take over the narrative function and keep the internal monologue running in altered form. We've built a world that reinforces this constant stimulation, that surrounds us with inputs designed to capture attention, to inform or entertain or persuade, or simply fill the space that might otherwise be empty, that might otherwise contain silence. And while some of that noise serves purposes, communication, warning, connection, beauty, much of it exists simply because silence makes us uncomfortable, makes us feel alone, or unproductive, or like we're missing something important that's happening somewhere else, some conversation or event or development that we should know about, should be part of, should be tracking in real time, even though most of what we track turns out to be neither urgent nor important, just more noise adding to the accumulated noise we've already internalized, already processed, already responded to, without necessarily benefiting from the exchange. And yet we seek silence, or say we do, talk about needing quiet time, needing to unplug, needing to escape the constant demands on our attention, though what we usually mean by silence isn't really silence in any absolute sense, but rather a reduction in noise, a temporary decrease in stimulation that feels like relief compared to the baseline level of acoustic and mental activity we've grown accustomed to, that feels restful, not because it's truly quiet, but because it's quieter, because the volume has dropped even if it hasn't disappeared, because some of the inputs have been removed even if others remain, giving us enough of a break from the constant barrage that we can catch our breath, can process what we've already accumulated, can remember what it feels like to exist, without quite so much happening all at once. We retreat to quiet places, parks, libraries, rural areas where population density is low enough that human-generated noise diminishes. But even there, true silence is rare, almost impossible to find, because the world we've built extends everywhere humans live, creates ambient sound that travels for miles, produces vibrations that propagate through ground and air and water, until almost no location on Earth's land surface is free from at least some audible trace of human activity, some distant highway or aircraft or settlement producing enough noise that it registers, however faintly, however much we might tune it out or fail to notice it consciously, contributing to an acoustic environment that never quite drops to zero, never quite achieves the kind of absolute quiet that existed before we learned to produce sound at industrial scales, before we developed technologies that hum and buzz and rumble continuously, regardless of whether anyone is listening or needs them to be operating or benefits from their constant background presence. The ocean's depths offer something we can't find anywhere in our usual lives, something we can barely imagine because we've never experienced it directly, never had access to a place where silence isn't a temporary reduction in noise, but a permanent condition, where the absence of sound is so complete, so fundamental, so built into the nature of the environment that it can't be broken, can't be interrupted, can't be compromised by anything we might bring to it, because the physical conditions that create and maintain that silence are more powerful than any sound-generating mechanism we possess, more durable than any disturbance we could produce, more absolute than any quiet we could achieve through effort or discipline, or the mere removal of obvious noise sources. And maybe that's what draws us to thinking about these places, to contemplating environments we'll almost certainly never visit, never directly experience, never inhabit even briefly, They represent something we lack, something we've lost or never had, something that exists in theory but rarely in practice for organisms like us, who evolved in acoustic environments and built civilizations that amplify rather than reduce the ambient noise level, that add to rather than subtract from the constant stream of sounds that characterize inhabited spaces, leaving us with a vague sense that we're missing something, that there should be places where we can experience real quiet, not just reduced noise, but actual silence. And if such places exist, they exist primarily in imagination or in remote locations like the deep ocean, where human presence is so rare, so brief, so technologically mediated that it barely counts as presence at all, leaving the silence undisturbed, unchanged, available in theory, but inaccessible in practice to anyone seeking it as refuge or relief or respite from the acoustic world we've created on land. But perhaps the value of knowing these silent places exist isn't diminished by our inability to reach them. Perhaps knowing that somewhere, even if it's miles below the surface of the ocean, even if it's in an environment we could never survive without technology that would itself break the silence, there are spaces where quiet is absolute, where sound doesn't exist, where the physics and chemistry and biology have aligned in a way that excludes noise entirely, offers us something conceptual, something we can hold in mind as a reference point, as proof that silence at that level is possible, is real, is not just the temporary absence of noise, but a stable state that persists regardless of what's happening elsewhere, regardless of how loud the surface world becomes, regardless of how much noise we produce or how widely we distribute it, because the deep ocean, in its remoteness and its extremity and its fundamental incompatibility with human activity, maintains its quiet as surely as it maintains its pressure and its cold and its darkness, preserving something that we can no longer preserve on land, that we've traded away in favor of connectivity and convenience and constant availability, leaving it to exist primarily in places we can't reach, can't inhabit, can't experience except through description and imagination, and the kind of quiet contemplation that tries, however inadequately, to approximate what it might be like to exist in a space where nothing makes sound, where nothing can make sound, where silence isn't something you create through effort, but something you enter, something that surrounds you, something that exists independent of your presence or absence, continuing before you arrive and after you leave, patient and permanent and utterly indifferent to whether anyone notices it or values it or thinks about it at all. Perhaps what we're really seeking when we talk about needing silence isn't the absence of external sound, though that helps, certainly, makes it easier, but rather the kind of mental state that silence can facilitate, the quieting of internal noise, the slowing of thought, the settling of attention into something more focused or more diffuse depending on what we need, less concerned with processing inputs and more capable of simply being present, simply existing without constantly narrating. That existence or analyzing it or comparing it to other experiences or planning what comes next, just allowing experience to occur without adding commentary, without generating the internal acoustic environment that mirrors and amplifies the external one. And if that's what we're after, if that's the real goal underlying our stated desire for quiet, then maybe the deep ocean serves as more than just an example of physical silence. It serves as a model, as a demonstration that existence without constant stimulation is possible, that places and organisms can function perfectly well without sound, without the acoustic richness we assume is necessary or normal or beneficial, suggesting that maybe we don't need quite as much as we think we need, quite as much noise or information or constant input, that there might be value in spaces, both external and internal, where less is happening, where attention can rest, where the absence of stimulation isn't deprivation but rather a different mode of being, one that we've mostly forgotten how to access, but that remains available, remains possible, remains worth seeking, even if we can only approximate it, even if true silence, the kind that exists at the bottom of the ocean, remains forever beyond our direct reach. Perhaps the bottom of the ocean was never meant to be understood in the way we understand other places, never meant to be mapped completely or visited regularly or made familiar through repeated exposure. Perhaps it exists partly to remain unknown, to stay remote, to continue its patient existence in conditions so far removed from our daily experience that thinking about it requires a kind of mental shift, a willingness to accept that some places function according to principles we can describe, but never fully inhabit, never fully internalize as part of our lived reality. The silence there isn't waiting for us to discover it, or document it, or break it with our presence, isn't diminished by our lack of direct experience with it, isn't made less real or less significant by the fact that we'll almost certainly never hear it ourselves, never stand in a place where that level of quiet surrounds us, never know what it actually feels like to exist in an environment where sound has been excluded so completely that even the concept of hearing becomes irrelevant, becomes a sense that offers no information because there's no information to offer, no vibrations to detect, no acoustic landscape to navigate or interpret or respond to. It continues regardless, that silence, sustained by pressure and cold and distance, and the simple fact that nothing there generates the kind of disturbance that would translate into sound, maintaining itself through physics rather than through any conscious preservation, any intentional protection, just existing as it always has, as it presumably always will, at least on timescales that matter to us, to our species, to the brief span of human history that barely registers against the geological patience of the seafloor, the tectonic slowness of the trenches, the deep time that governs everything happening at those depths where change is measured in millennia and stability is the default condition, the baseline against which all other states are compared and found temporary, found fleeting, found insufficient to disturb the fundamental stillness that defines these places more completely than any other characteristic we might identify or measure or attempt to describe. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing that such silence exists, that somewhere beneath the storms and the waves and the constant activity of the surface layers, there are spaces where quiet is absolute, where the world has arranged itself in a way that excludes noise entirely, offers something valuable even if we can't experience it directly, even if we can only approach it through imagination and description, and the kind of contemplative thinking that tries to bridge the gap between what we know intellectually and what we can grasp experientially, between facts and feeling, between understanding that something is true and actually comprehending what that truth means, what it implies, what it might be like to exist within it, rather than merely observe it from a distance. The deep ocean, in its silence and its remoteness and its fundamental separation from the world we inhabit, reminds us that Earth still contains mysteries, still harbors environments that resist our attempts to make them familiar, to bring them into the sphere of human activity and human understanding, to convert them from unknown to known, from remote to accessible, from alien to ordinary. And perhaps there's value in that resistance, in the way these places maintain their otherness, their strangeness, their refusal to become just another location we've visited and documented and moved on from, leaving them instead as permanent reminders that the planet is larger than our experience of it, more varied than the places we inhabit, more complex than the environments we've adapted to, containing depths and extremes and conditions that exist outside the range of what we consider normal or possible or compatible with the kind of life we know. The silence that exists at the bottom of the ocean isn't calling to us, isn't inviting exploration or demanding attention or asking to be heard. It simply is, continuing its existence whether we think about it or not, whether we send submersibles down to measure it or leave it completely alone, whether we find value in contemplating it or never consider it at all, just persisting in the dark, cold depths where water presses down with forces we can barely imagine, and nothing moves except on geological timescales. And the only sound is the absence of sound, the pure quiet that comes from an environment where all the mechanisms that produce noise have been removed or suppressed or rendered inoperative by conditions so extreme that sound becomes impossible, becomes physically excluded from the set of phenomena that can occur there, leaving only stillness, only pressure, Only the slow, patient accumulation of sediment and the rare, sparse presence of organisms adapted to exist in a place. That seems designed to exclude life, but somehow accommodates it anyway, in minimal forms, in reduced states, in ways that barely register as living, but continue nonetheless, persisting in the silence as if to demonstrate that existence doesn't require noise, doesn't need acoustic richness or sensory stimulation, or any of the inputs we assume are necessary for experience to be meaningful, valuable, worth sustaining. Perhaps we don't need to visit these places to benefit from knowing they exist, don't need to hear the silence to understand what it offers, don't need to experience the pressure and the cold and the darkness to recognize that somewhere, even now, even as noise surrounds us and demands attention and fills every available space in our lives, there are environments where quiet is complete, where stillness is permanent, where the world continues its ancient work without announcement, without narration, without any acknowledgement that anything is happening at all. And in that continuing silence, in that persistent quiet, there might be something we need, even if we can't quite articulate what it is, or why it matters, or how knowing about it changes anything in our daily existence. Just the simple fact that it's there, that it persists, that the planet still contains spaces where sound has never been and never will be, where silence isn't temporary or fragile or easily broken, but fundamental and permanent and as close to absolute as anything on Earth can be. If this journey brought you a sense of calm, you can subscribe to Quiet Science and continue exploring these silent depths with us.